This is a production of Cornell University.
So I wanted to talk today about food waste and its land use implications. This is a quote. These are the first lines actually of Tristram Stewart's book on food waste, which was first published in 2009. And I think his book remains one of the most comprehensive and well-researched yet still very broadly accessible books on food waste. And what he's talking about here is the very rapid conversion of our land resources into fields and food factories. And, you know, we can take that insight or that fact into lots of different directions. And Stewart's focus and the focus of my research is on food waste. So here is the very same information in graphic form. This graph uses information from the FAO. The first row of it shows that just 29% of the Earth's surface is land. The second row shows that about 71% of that land is habitable. The rest of it is glacier or desert or salt flat or some other formation that makes it unfit for human habitation. The third row, which I think is the key line in the graph, is that we are currently using half of that for agriculture. About 37% of the remainder is forested, 11% is shrubland within very tiny proportions that make up our cities and freshwater sort of waterways. So when we expand agricultural production, we're increasing the amount of forested land and the carbon sinks that we have. And then continuing on, those bottom three rows, what you can see there is that when you look at how we use that agricultural land, most of it's used to produce livestock. So it's used either for grazing or to produce feed for livestock, and that's mostly soy and corn. But last two lines, the last two rows, most of our calories and even most of our protein don't come from meat and dairy. They come from plant-based crops, which are grown on a very small proportion of our agricultural land. So I think that that graphic packs a lot of information onto one page. This is actually a different visual of the same process. This was the Brazilian Amazon just a couple of years ago in 2019. The dynamic underpinning the fires was the clearing of the forest for the expansion of soybean farming in South America. There was a particular push at that time to put more land under cultivation because of the trade war between the US and China that you may remember. But as that map on the right shows, or at least the right of my screen shows, in Argentina and Bolivia and Paraguay and Brazil, forest was cleared and grasslands were converted into soybean plantations on a massive scale. So since the 1970s, over half of the Cerrado in Brazil, which is probably the most biodiverse savanna in the world, has been turned into agricultural fields. And so the burning of this particular incident became a global story because it was the Amazon and because of the very high profile trade war with China. But the destruction of forested land is happening much more quietly on an ongoing basis all over the world. And food loss and food waste are directly implicated in those dynamics and of course in climate change. If we wasted less of the food that we produce, there would be less pressure to clear more of this land. So at the UN Food Summit this past fall, it was estimated that the amount of land we use to produce food that's lost or wasted is greater than the size of China, which means greater than the size of the United States, right? And that's a lot of land to be clearing and using to produce food that no one ever eats. Here are two graphics from a very recent report called the Food Waste Index. That's by the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP. Numbers, I will say, are very tricky when it comes to food waste. We don't have a lot of great data on food loss and food waste, so it's been difficult to quantify it, to measure it, and therefore to measure our progress on reducing it. So I would treat all numbers as approximations. But most of the time, we say that about 1/3 of the food that we produce is lost or wasted. And this recent UNEP report actually suggests that the problem may be even larger than that. So just terminology, we generally use the term food loss to refer to food that is lost in the production and the processing stages before it ever reaches a retail outlet or the consumer. So food that was damaged in the field, or food that was simply not harvested because of cosmetic standards or for some other reason, or food that spoiled in storage or on the way from the farm to the processing plant. That would be food loss. And that's a major problem in poor countries in particular because of a lack of reliable transportation, lack of climate controlled storage facilities. We use the term food waste, and that's the subject of this UNEP report, to refer to food that is not sold or eaten at the retail, the food service, or the consumer end of the supply chain. So we used to think that food waste was more prevalent in wealthy countries than in poor countries. This UNEP report actually challenges that idea. One of the key findings from the report is that household food waste is a problem across income levels. It's a problem in poor countries just as it is in wealthy ones, and we need to pay attention to it everywhere. Another finding from this report is that food waste in households may be twice as high as we previously thought. So the graphic on the left shows that households are the source of most food waste, followed by food service and then retail. And the graphic on the right breaks this down by country. So countries with large populations like China and India understandably produce in net terms the most food waste. And that's what the orange bars there depict. But the yellow circles on the right show food waste per capita, right? And the picture there is that some countries are more wasteful than others on a per capita basis. Australia, in this case, comes out on top with 102 kilograms of food per person per year. It's about 225 pounds. So broadly, the picture that emerges from the UNEP report is that no matter how you measure it, food waste is a huge problem practically everywhere in the world. So food waste under anaerobic conditions in landfills, for example, produces methane. We all know that. And that's, of course, a problem. But when we waste food, the part that many people don't think about is that we waste a lot of embedded energy or a lot of resources that have gone into producing that food in the. And I already mentioned that the amount of land we use to produce food that's lost or wasted is greater than the size of China or the United States. Also at the UN Food Summit this past fall, presenters noted that about a quarter of the world's freshwater resources that are used for agriculture go into food that's lost or wasted. Meat and dairy products are particularly resource intensive to produce. You saw that in terms of the land that's devoted to animal production, but meat and dairy also require an enormous amount of water. One hamburger, in this case from the Sierra Club, takes about 600 gallons of water to produce. So when we waste food, we not only create greenhouse gases in the way that we dispose of it, but we also energy and the resources that are embedded in that food, the land, the water, the nutrients that were required to grow it and produce it, the fuel that we used to transport it from one place to another, and the energy that was required to store it, to cook it, and so on. So these are food recovery hierarchies. Many of you have probably seen these and know these. There are many different versions of this hierarchy. I'm showing you one on the left from the EPA, one on the right from the European Environmental Agency. And what these show are different strategies and different priorities for managing wasted or excess or surplus food. And there will always be surplus. That's what food security is about. Surplus is a good thing within limits. But what we do with that surplus is important. And so at the top is the most preferred strategy, which is source reduction, or actually prevention, which means not producing waste in the first place or reducing the amount of surplus that we produce. And at the bottom is the least preferred strategy for managing food waste, and that's putting it in a landfill. So the strategies at the top create the most benefits for the environment and also society and the economy. The strategies toward the bottom create the fewest benefits. And what we currently do is actually the inverse of this. We currently landfill most of the food we waste. We compost a very small proportion of it, and we convert an even smaller amount into energy through biodigestion and animal feed. So in other words, we have a very linear food system, production, consumption, disposal, rather than a circular one. You will also note on this EPA hierarchy that among the recycling strategies, after you get past donation and feeding hungry people, the rest of those are recycling strategies. Among them, feeding scraps to animals is the preferred recycling strategy, more than digestion or waste to energy, and more than composting. And that's because it keeps food in the human food supply chain. So one of the takeaways from the land use graph that I showed earlier is that we should all be eating more plant-based diets. I think we can probably conclude that from those data. But animal protein is a really important part of many people's diets around the world. It's very important to nutritional security and food security in many places. So, I think there is the question of how do we find ways to produce animal protein that's less land and resource intensive. And there's a lot of good research being done on this right now, including some by some of my colleagues in the Department of Global Development. These are just a couple of their publications. There's also a lot of on the ground experimentation with closed loop or circular production systems. This is Kipster, which is a Dutch company that's producing net zero carbon eggs, in part through feeding chickens entirely on food scraps, rather than using land to produce feed. This particular company is expanding to the US. We also have some models of this on a smaller scale in the US already. In New York State, the policy environment for pushing experimentation on this front became much more favorable this year, as New York State became, on January 1st, the 6th state in the country to adopt a commercial organics ban. The bans in these states that are highlighted here in the Northeast and in California, there are also some municipalities that have commercial organics bans, are all very different in character. The one in New York applies to generators that produce 2 tons of excess food per week or more. So colleges, supermarkets, restaurants, pretty large scale commercial entities. In New York, generators have to donate edible food to food banks and to food pantries, and they have to recycle food scraps as long as there's a recycling facility within 25 miles of their operation. And so recycling could be any one of those strategies that I showed you in the food recovery hierarchy. It could be feeding scraps to animals, it could be digestion, it could be composting. And the expectation is that these bans, this new policy, will lead to new markets, to new experiments, and to new infrastructure in the state. And that's, if you look at what happened in some of the other states, you can see the impetus that policy that provides. In Vermont, for example, which is the state that I think has the most expansive food waste ban, no food waste goes to landfill. It all has to be recycled, including at the household level. So right now I'm doing some research for the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York on the opportunities and constraints related to feeding food scraps to animals. There are constraints, but there are also lots of opportunities and some really interesting models for how to do this. There's as I think alluded to just a slide ago, there's a small scale company in Vermont that's doing the same thing as Kipster. There are dairy farmers, there are pig farmers feeding scraps to their animals, and in some cases raising their animals on a diet made up entirely or almost entirely of food scraps. And in some cases that has required important changes, including working with particular breeds of animals. And a lot of research and a lot of experimentation. So I don't have time to talk a lot about that, my project today. I hope I can do that at some later date, but I'll just end by saying that there's a lot of work being done to reduce the food feed competition and to reduce the amount of land that's used to grow crops to feed animals. So I would just close with this quote: reducing food waste and creating circular systems and keeping food in the human food supply chain is right at the center of many of these questions about land use. If we don't want to continue to convert forests into fields, we need to deal with our food waste problem. And in addition to eating more plant-based diets, that means producing animal proteins in much more environmentally friendly ways, and feeding our food scraps to animals may be one of them. So thanks very much. And I hope maybe there's time for some questions.
There is definitely time for some questions, but nobody has posted a question. So I guess, what is one of the most innovative food recovery strategies that you've seen that is exciting to you?
You know, Blue Hill at Stone Barns is, you know, a very upscale restaurant in the Hudson Valley, and they are feeding their pigs entirely on recovered materials. So brewer's grains, but also kitchen scraps and so forth. And they have done a tremendous amount of experimentation. They have changed the breed of pig that they raise to do that. And that's, you know, that's perhaps not a great example, because that's a place that can charge a premium for their product. There are, I'll say that what there tend to be are very scaled up versions of food scrap recovery and feed production, or very small scale sort of mom and pop level kinds of operations. So an example, Connecticut is doing, there's a really interesting project underway there. A food scrap recycler is building an enormous facility that should have the capacity to collect all the food scraps in the state of Connecticut. It's pretty centrally located, and they're going to be producing pellets for animal feed. That they're under construction now. It's not operational yet, but their equivalent of the Department of Environmental Conservation in Connecticut is very excited about the capacity that they're going to have to recycle nearly all the food scraps in the state in that way. In New York, there are lots of, there are a couple, I think there's one example of a very large scale food waste collector who is producing animal feed. It's a bakery mix. It's mostly products from bakeries and you know, cookies, candies, those kinds of things that he then sells to dairy farmers and cattle farmers across the Northeast, even into Canada. And that mix can make up about 4 to 6% of the ration, of the dairy ration. Much more common are very sort of small scale operations where smaller scale farmers will have a relationship with a local store or a local restaurant and will pick up food scraps and feed them at home. There have been some innovative, you know, sort of pet food applications. Those don't really count in terms of, you know, keeping food scraps in the human food chain. So they're not considered food scrap recycling, at least for the purposes of the EPA's hierarchy. But so there are large scale, small scale, and some models emerging as people try to figure this out.
Neat. So Sycamore May asks, Lori, do you know if there's any work being done on the FDA to feed compost to commercial livestock, like chickens, for example? Do you know if the livestock get the nutrients they need from compost?
There is a very interesting operation in Vermont that is a vertically integrated farm. It's a composting farm that feeds chickens entirely on food scraps and allows the chickens to sort of pick around the food scraps to get what they want. And it's a laying operation. And so it's very much like Hipster. It's the example that I was giving when I was speaking about the Hipster farms. And the operator of that has really done a lot of research is a very, I would say, this is not a backyard operation. It's a very well-researched thing that he's doing. And it's local. I mean, it's an extremely localized operation. He collects food scraps from within his municipality, and he sells his eggs within his municipality. But he's been, and he has a pretty small size flock as egg layers go. I mean, it's 300 laying hens. It's not tiny, but it's not, it's not, I think the egg production has become so concentrated that it's certainly not a large scale operation. But at that scale, I think he's been very successful.
So David K asks, since you took a global perspective initially, can you talk about how aspects and especially solutions to the waste issue tend to vary by location in the world in general and by location with the US as well?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Could you talk about how aspects and especially solutions to the waste issue tend to vary by location in the world or in the US as well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in the US, we have a patchwork. We have a patchwork of laws that vary by state and by municipality. And that makes it tough because, especially if you look at the Northeast, we don't necessarily, respect state borders. There's a lot of cross-border traffic. And so, the person who started the chicken farm in Vermont actually was a New York resident and moved to Vermont because the legislation there made it easier for him to do his operation in Vermont instead of New York. So I think that there's a and we have the same thing around date labeling. If you look at the date labeling laws, if you're a manufacturer and you sell to multiple states, you're going to take the most conservative stance on, that exists in any state, and you're going to use it because you want to be able to sell in that state. It's not necessarily the most favorable application for reducing food waste because of confusion over date labels. But of course, that's what manufacturers who sell across state borders are going to do. So I think we have some federal standards, cosmetic standards, grading standards around apples, for example, that allow both interstate and cross-country commerce to proceed with people knowing what they're going to get. But we have a lot of state by state and even municipality by municipality kinds of laws and policies that really do impact food waste. For the most part in New York, we don't require date labels, but there are a few counties, and I think is one of them, that requires date labels on dairy products. And, that sort of sets the tone for the whole state and beyond.
Another question from Susan Holcomb. Do you have an opinion about pasture raised and finished animals?
Well, I think this is interesting because, one of the things that we've heard a lot in our research is that farmers are very worried about finishing times. And, Blue Hill, talks about it does take longer. Finishing times for their pigs are longer than they would be if they didn't use food scraps. And a lot of pig farmers in New York, there's, I think, a dwindling number of pig farms in the state, but a lot of pig farmers will say that there are so few butchering facilities that they have to book times to slaughter their animals almost as the animals are born. And so there's really no margin for error in terms of, finishing them. That has become so I think our food system, the way we think about the production of animals, the timelines that requires in order for them to, that operation to be profitable, actually determines, our ability to to think about using food scraps for animal feed in really fundamental ways. So I would say that that distinction is I mean, that's how I would think about that distinction, that I think a lot of people really think about getting animals to wait at a particular time, and they need to do whatever it takes to get there.
Okay, my last question for you is, can you just briefly describe your DEC report and when it will be released? And of course, we will invite you back to present on that. But I just want to let everybody know about this work that you're doing so that they can be primed and ready to receive it when you release it.
Well, thank you. So the DEC project and report, and I should say it's also funded by NEFA and a Hatch grant, was to look at the opportunities and constraints related to diverting more of our food scraps to animals and to animal feed across the state. So it will be ready this summer. It will be coming out this summer, and we've done a lot of interviews with generators. We've done a lot of interviews with farmers who are using food scraps on farms. We've done a lot of interviews with state officials in other states that have introduced organics bans before New York to find out how they promoted this or what's happening in their states around the diversion of food scraps to animal feed. We've interviewed mills and others who are producing rations and animal nutritionists. And now what we're doing is making site visits to innovators, farmers we're going to a dairy next week that they're using food scraps to feed their cows. And so we hope that these case studies are useful to people as well. So Jenny, it is coming out this summer, and be happy to talk about it in the fall.
Fantastic.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.